So I'm John Henry. I'm chairman of the Committee for the Republic, and we want to welcome everybody tonight here. It's a very good occasion tonight. Very, very excited about this award. So why do you think whistleblowers dominate the headline news so much? The answer is pretty simple, that members of Congress fail to uphold their oath of office to honor the Constitution. Congress rubber stamps the executive. Now, the Constitution created a republic where Congress is the dominant branch, not a co-equal branch. Congress has 17 expressly enumerated powers, plus a residual authority to legislate in furtherance of any power conferred by the Constitution, whether it's legislative, judicial, or executive. And the war power is by far the most important. In times of war, unchecked government power is at its zenith, and liberty is at its nadir. Executive powers are narrowly circumscribed, to receiving, for example, receiving ambassadors or being commander-in-chief, but only after Congress declares war. And Congress is protected from executive intimidation by the speech or debate clause, while the president can be impeached and removed for Congress for high crimes and misdemeanors, and is subject to congressional oversight to expose executive crimes and abuses. Now, national ambitions have taken a wrecking ball to the Constitution. At our creation, the glory of the United States was liberty and the march of the mind, was protected by popular and leadership veneration of separation of powers, checking ambition with ambition. But after the founding generation, power replaced liberty as the glory of the nation under the banner of manifest destiny, sporting a foreign policy of might makes right. Empires require unity of command and secrecy, limitless executive power in lieu of congressional dominance. Now, without voter pushback, the Democratic and Republican parties tortured the Constitution, making it a homonym of the original text. The unprecedented powers so purposely allocated to Congress were surrendered to the executive in violation of the Constitution without a whisper of dissent from Republican Democratic Party. The parties competed over who would run the empire, not over whether the Constitution should be honored. It speaks volumes, for example, that Barack Obama makes only one passing reference to the Constitution in his 768-page memoir, while counter-constitutionally asserting he was elected president to make us safe. Liberty, the opportunity of individuals to march to their own drummer, is denied even a cameo appearance. Now, secrecy is the coin of the realm of an imperial presidency. And as the Pentagon Papers reveal, Truman, and as you've seen, many of you have had a chance to watch, Max tells me quite a number of you have been able to watch this excellent movie, The Most Dangerous Man in America, which we're going to be getting to. As the movie brings out, Pentagon Papers reveal, President Truman lied to the American people about the Vietnam War when the French were involved. President Eisenhower concocted the domino theory, and President Kennedy lied about the ZM assassination. President Johnson lied about the Gulf of Tonkin and the Operation Rolling Thunder. President Nixon lied about his secret plan in Vietnam. Now, Daniel Ellsberg diligently worked for the imperial presidency, but Dan was much more than the best and the brightest. Dan had a strong moral compass and the courage to follow it. Working on Robert McNamara's secret Pentagon Papers, Dan was shocked to learn how successive presidents lied to the American people. Dan was nauseated by the chronicle of bipartisan deceit, but Dan followed the Constitution. Dan offered Congress the opportunity to discharge its oversight responsibilities. He gave 3 senators the Pentagon Papers, but Senators William Fulbright, George McGovern, and Chuck Mathias had other priorities. Dan then took the First Amendment route and gave the Pentagon Papers to the media. When the New York Times was enjoined, he gave them to 18 other newspapers, all the time risking criminal prosecution under the 1917 Espionage Act, the legacy of President Woodrow Wilson's crusade against World War I dissent. When the Pentagon Papers were classified pursuant to an executive order, I might add, that was never enacted by Congress. The Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black in the New York Times versus the United States recognized the publication of the Pentagon Papers as among the Constitution's finest hours. And I quote him, paramount among the responsibilities of a free press is the duty to prevent any part of the government from deceiving the people or sending them off to distant lands to die, close quote. I know you agree with me that Dan Ellsberg richly deserves the Committee for the Republic's Defender of Liberty Award. I can say without hesitation that no whistleblower is made of sterner stuff. Dan, I want to show you the award. Max, can you put it up so it can be seen?
Here we go.
Can you get it up?
Can we
Okay.
see that?
And Dan, all of our Defender of Liberty awards have the Aristotle quote, "The courage is the first virtue, the most important, because without it, none of the others would be possible." So we're very, very excited to have this, very honored to be able to give you this award, and we appreciate you doing this. We picked tonight, we tried to pick a date that was significant. There were a number of dates, the 50th anniversary of the New York Times publication or the other ones, but we picked today, the 30th, because that today is the 50th anniversary of the Supreme Court decision. And we're all about the Constitution. So thank you, Dan. So many of you have had a chance to watch the movie. It's really an amazingly good movie, The Most Dangerous Man in America. It's a quote from Henry Kissinger about Dan. It really, I guess, the most dangerous man in America for an empire, but not the people that called you that, Dan, were the most dangerous people for the Republic. So we want to now segue to have our 2 filmmakers, Rick Goldsmith and Judy Ehrlich, and Ron Maxwell, who's a well-known maker of Gettysburg and Gods and Generals, Copperhead. He's going to do a little film speak with you, and this will get us into a broader conversation. So go ahead, Ron, it's all yours.
Great, great to be with you all. Mr. Ellsberg, what an honor. 74 years old, so I was in my early 20s and out there doing what I could, protesting, marching, and you made a big difference. A genuine American hero. You were a hero then, and so thrilling to meet you all these decades later in this Zoom call. The motion picture, the documentary film, The Most Dangerous Man in America, opened at the Toronto International Film Festival, September 2009, got nominated for an Academy Award, had a 4-month theatrical run, and was broadcast on PBS, and has subsequently been shown in more than 30 countries around the world. I'd call that a successful film. Rick and Goldsmith and Judith Ehrlich are the filmmakers. They're on with us for this call. I apologize for my video not working, but I hope you can all hear me. Rick First thing I want to ask you is, I'm curious about how this film started. What's the origin of this film? What prompted you to dive into this very ambitious undertaking?
I had read Dan's book Secrets and was tremendously impressed with it and moved by it. I was 20 years old at the time that the Pentagon Papers were published. So I was, I remembered those events. And I actually knew Dan because he was in a previous film that I had done on an old muckraking journalist named George Seldes. And Dan was in that film. So I knew him personally, and he was kind of in the neighborhood. And I sent him a kind of a 2-page outline of what I thought would be a great film. And I never heard back from him. He might've been on a big book tour at the time, whatever. And, but I thought the story was really important for today. And sometime later, maybe it was in the next year or so, Judy came into my office. We worked in the same building in West Berkeley called the Fantasy Building after Fantasy Films. And she said, what do you think about a film on Dan Ellsberg? So I said, well, it's funny you should mention that. And I took out my outline and then we talked about it. And the first thing we actually did together once we decided to do this is we heard that Dan and his wife, Patricia, were speaking at a local high school. And well, let's go down there and hear what they have to say and then approach them with the idea. And I guess I'll hand it over to Judy from there.
So Judith, Rick is crediting you with the original suggestion. What got into your head to think of making a documentary on Dan Ellsberg?
Well, it's such an obvious subject, and and we all live in Berkeley, or Dan's in Kensington, but very close by. So, I mean, it came up, and Dan and I have very close mutual friends, and it just suddenly felt like something hiding in plain sight with all, because I have a lot of ideas, but they take years to materialize. So this one just kept coming back, and finally I thought, really need to do this. I really need to do it. And I wrote a proposal, and then I knew Rick was interested in these issues, and he was down the hall, and it just seemed like it might be a good collaboration. And so Dan, we went to see Dan and Patricia, and once we saw the two of them together, it was like, oh my God, this is not just about being the most courageous person in the universe. It's also about this fabulous love story and their relationship, and Patricia as a character. And so it just added this element of real humanity to it that made it irresistible. And
Judy, while you were thinking of this movie, were there events happening in real time that prompted you of this whole story of the Pentagon Papers? Were there things contemporaneously going on in 2007, 2008?
Good question. There are always things going on that make me think that we needed Dan. I mean, it's constant, isn't it? But actually, one of the most interesting things about this film is that, and Rick and I love saying this, that Dan inspired Edward Snowden to leak the papers, not the papers, the material he leaked. And when we went out to Q&As and to show the film, whenever Dan was there, he would get up on the stage and say, anybody got any secrets? Ha ha ha. Because no one had leaked anything for the period between the time that he leaked his secrets and the time that we were showing the film in 2009, 2010, 2011. And it was just at the time Julian Assange emerged, as I was here in Sydney for the film festival in Australia. And it's just, from there, it's been a lot of whistleblowers and a lot of punishment of whistleblowers. And it's been a new period since the film was released. Not because of the film at that point, but it just happened that there's a lot more now that reminds us every day about the importance of protecting whistleblowers.
Rick, there's so much.
And I just want to add to that, Ron, what you said, well, what was going on at the time. Actually, we started, I think it was 2004, which we started maybe the collaboration and pre-production. But, we were in Afghanistan and we were in Iraq. And clearly we had been lied into Iraq, and you could probably say that about Afghanistan as well. So it really was, it was, the issues were hanging there, the parallels between then Vietnam, and now, which was Afghanistan and Iraq. And they were unmistakable. And you could do the whole film and never once mention Iraq or Afghanistan, and it's clear to the audience how resonant it was.
The film has got at least two things going on in terms of its threads. One is the personal story, which is an immense story in and of itself. And the other one, of course, is the war and the politics. It seemed like a very daunting thing to start at the beginning of that process. How did the two of you shape this and decide on the decisions you made?
Oh, it was really easy. No, not at all. It took years. It took years to decide on how to do it. And I think the idea that Dan would be the narrator was right at the end. We debated that for a long time, and it was something I wanted, and Rick didn't think it might work, and we were back and forth, and people trying to convince us both ways. And anyway, I'm really thrilled that Dan narrates it. And there were, should we do animation? Should we do recreations? All of those things, and just the structure. Rick's really good at putting this historical structure together. And that sort of fell into place with a year and a half of editing, Rick, was it?
Oh, probably. I mean, I think, you start editing really as soon as you get footage, you start editing. So they overlap with production,
Yeah, because Rick did the first edit, so it took a long time, and then we brought in two other editors along the way. But yeah, it emerged over a long process that involved a lot of people helping us, and beating our heads against the wall.
The film obviously had a big impact on Snowden. Can you relate any other anecdotes of other people for which the film had a big impact?
Well, when we first started showing the film, and so, Judith and I went out, and Dan and often Patricia were out, and we were doing Q&As. And to a little bit of my chagrin, but not surprise, the average age of the audience was, let's say, pre-Vietnam. I mean, the average age of the audience was probably 55 or 60. And we really wanted to hit young people. And we did. And we found high school classes and college classes and young people in the audience with the 55 and 6-year-olds. And they got it. And if there's one person that I remember, I couldn't say that other than Edward Snowden, who, when he said he was influenced by watching the film, I mean, chills went down my spine. But we did find that young people throughout the country at every screening really not only got the film, but added their own perspective on what they felt about government, about secrets, about who rules the roost and who gets to speak. And so it really felt like we did our job. We did reach all these segments of the population.
And
go ahead.
Just one of the most amazing Q&As that we did was at this Palm Springs Film Festival, and they brought 1,000 kids in from the whole Palm Springs area to this huge hall in Palm Springs. And they showed it after a cute little rom-com, and I thought, oh, they're not going to get this at all. And they were amazing. I mean, they asked the most intelligent questions. It's a very working class area outside of, middle of Palm Springs. And they moved me tremendously by how intelligent they were and how much this moved them and how excited they were. And I mean, every hand in the place went up with a question and a comment. So it was great to get it out and really see the audience with the film.
You've got some terrific interviews in the film. Any adventure stories about corralling those interviews? And did any interviews just become impossible to get because of age or death or other factors that intervened while you were making the film?
First, at the risk of embarrassing him in front of everybody, one of my favorite interviews, besides Dan, was Hedrick Smith. And we interviewed him at my friend's house in Bethesda, Maryland, and Hedrick came over. and he must have just had coffee, or maybe he's like this always.
He's
But he
always that
sat
way.
down, and I asked my first question, and boom, I mean, he was off and running, you know, and he's talking about, you know, and Neil said to me, "Hey, Rick, look at what we've got, you know, the telegrams from Westmoreland to Johnson to this to Taylor and so forth." And we were there, and they were lying through their teeth. I mean, he was just, it was amazing. I almost didn't have to ask follow-up questions. Well, I did, but he was terrific. And so that was really one of my favorite interviews. The one person that I worked on and we couldn't get him was Harry Rowan, Dan's boss at the Rand Corporation. And I had several conversations with him on the phone, and I thought he was going to tip, and I thought he was going to go for it. And at the last minute, well, not at the last minute, he declined. I thought it would have been a great interview. So.
Well, if I may, go ahead, Judy.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm having a brain freeze, but Rick, who was it that we met with at UC and we were going to interview, and then he was killed?
David Halberstam.
David
Oh my
Halberstam,
God.
who we really worked on to try to get him to agree to be interviewed. And we had this wonderful long conversation with him the night before, and we were going to fly to New York the next week. And then the next morning he was killed in a car accident.
Yeah, we were probably the last people, among the last people to talk with David Halberstam. My God. Yeah, how could I forget that? Yeah, it was the shock of my life.
Yeah, that was really pretty fun.
He was so generous with us. The night before, he stood with us for 45 minutes. You know, I had a little tape recorder going just to get his thoughts. And yeah, he invited us. He says, "You come to New York, you stay at our place, and we'll do an interview." And that was it. He was gone the next day.
Well, the film does reveal one of the shining moments of American journalism, for sure. Lest we forget that. Well, I think you guys, Rick and Judith, would you like to add anything before I toss it back to John?
I mean, the only thing I would add is it was without a doubt a high point of my life to spend those 4 years with Dan, with Patricia, with his son, you know, with all the people from the New York Times. I mean, you know, some of the great, John Dean, I mean, meeting all those people, but really getting to know Dan and feeling who he was, the totality of who he was. It was both inspiring to me and enriching to my life.
Ditto on that. And I just, it's been just a great honor to, and I put Dan in all my films now. So, you know, I've just had a new film out about war resistors in the Vietnam War, and Dan's in that too. And I'm working with him now on some short films about nuclear war and trying to stop the ICBM missile expansion. So I could just follow Dan around forever, and I'd be very happy. It's been a real honor to work with you and become your friend. Thanks, Dan.
Rick and Judy, thank you so much. Pleasure meeting you both. Congratulations on a terrific documentary film.
Thanks so much, Ron, and thanks for the interview.
And if anybody hasn't seen it, Max, I think we still have the links there, and you go up and see it. And it's really, really great movie. So thank you both for doing that.
You might put it on the chat, John. Just
Max, can we do that? Put it on the chat.
I can do that.
So two of the stars, as you heard, Mort Halperin and Hedrick Smith in the documentary, and so I guess chronologically we should probably start with Mort. And so Mort, do you want to jump in here? You're working on your memoir, so you're fresh on all the details, but where do you want to start the story with Dan? Because I think if there was, you know, if there's one person that influenced Dan the most, that Nixon was going to, and there was one thing that 4 presidents had lied to the American people about the Vietnam War, but Nixon ran on, you know, we've got to have peace with honor, and most people Rorschach their own understanding on that, that meant we were going to get out. And actually, he was expanding the war, and you had these conversations with Dan, and that was the decision point where, right, Dan tells me where so if you were a witness to history there, and so if you can pick up the story and tell, because Dan intersected with you at different times. He was on he worked on the Pentagon Papers itself, so he was deep into that, and then there's just these conversations that you had when you were at the NSC working for Kissinger. We'll take it from there.
Sorry, my connection keeps going in and out.
Okay, we got you.
Okay, I'm sorry. Could you I didn't hear your introduction to me or what you want me to focus on.
I said you and Hedrick were two of the stars in the film, and so you've already been introduced by the film, but I wanted you to explain your, how you the background, your relationship with Dan, and how things developed, and how your conversations with him when you were working for Kissinger on the NSC, when Nixon was had plans to expand the war, how your conversations were, Dan said, were instrumental in his decision to leak the Pentagon Papers.
I think I actually had on 3 or 4 different occasions interacted with Dan and the Pentagon Papers, all of which I think were necessary to lead to the point where Dan copied the papers and then gave them to the New York Times. And the first was I was in charge in the Pentagon of the production of the Pentagon Papers. And one of my tasks was to recruit people to write chapters of the Pentagon Papers. And I recruited Dan along with Les Gelb, who was working with me and was in the day-to-day charge of the project. So we recruited Dan, and he worked on the papers, and therefore he knew about them. And then when the project finally was finished, which was in the Nixon administration, Mel Ladd agreed that we could decide on the distribution of it. So we made up a distribution list that included a copy to go to me, Gelb, and Paul Warnke collectively. And we put that copy in the RAND Corporation with the understanding that Harry Rowan, the president of RAND, could read it, but that if he wanted anyone else to read it, he needed to get permission from me and then one of the other two, either Gelb or Warnke. And Harry called me up one day and said, I want to give access to the papers to Dan Ellsberg because he's doing a study for the Pentagon on the lessons of the Vietnam War, and these volumes are obviously relevant to that. And I consulted with Gelb and with Warnke, and we all agreed that we should not give Dan access to the papers because we thought if we gave him access, he would make them public. And so I said no to Harry. And then a couple of weeks later, he called me back and said that he couldn't accept that answer, that Dan had a government top secret clearance, was getting current top secret documents from the Pentagon to work on the study. These documents were several years old, and we should not be substituting our judgment for that of the government as to whether Dan was trustworthy and should be given access to classified information. And he said if we couldn't agree to give it to him, he would have to ask us to take the papers out of the RAND Corporation. So I consulted with Gelb, and we agreed to give Harry permission to get Dan access to the papers. Then the third connection, which led to the impact of the Pentagon Papers, has to do with Nixon 1. I was working for Henry Kissinger on the NS-16. Dan had drafted these questions that we sent to every agency in the government, asking them their assessment of what was going on in Vietnam. And then I got Kissinger's agreement to bring Dan back to help us write the summary of them, which he then took back with him to the RAND Corporation. And there's reason to believe that Nixon feared that Dan had Nixon 1 and might make that public, and that would have a direct impact on the Nixon administration. So I think that's probably enough.
Now, Mort, were you being wiretapped at that point, or because the Hedrick was wiretapped? what was the sequence? When was
Yeah,
that?
I was the first one wiretapped and the last one taken off. So anybody else who was wiretapped while I was wiretapped. And they never got anything. Haig, I think, Kissinger, I think, or Nixon said nothing but gobs and globs of gossip and bullshit, which is not the way I would describe my phone calls. But and Haig said there was nothing classified. You know, he wasn't close to revealing classified information on his wiretap. But the wiretap led to the ending of Dan's trial because the government had sworn that it had not overheard Dan on a wiretap and not overheard me because I was a consultant to the defense team at the Pentagon Papers trial. And then when Dean revealed that there had been this wiretap program, he said, and one of the interesting things was that Ellsberg was overheard on Halpern's wiretap. And so the Justice Department felt they had to report to the judge that this was done, that they had misstated truth in their, and then had tapes because they thought they had been stolen from the Justice Department and were missing. And it was because of that that the trial was ended by Byrne and charges against Dan dismissed. And then the last connection is that Dan reports, and he can report this in more detail than I can, that my telling him that Nixon was not ending the war, that he was going to expand the war, is what led Dan to decide that he had to release the Pentagon Papers. So I think those are enough connections.
It's an incredible story. It really is. So Rick, why don't we'll come back to Mort. So Rick, why don't you jump in? So when you know, I knew all you guys before Dan leaked this, but you got the papers and you and Sheehan, and basically you were running for what, 3 months, reading the 7,000 documents, what, 47 volumes, doing the stories, and then you had the legal fight inside. Why don't you take us? You were a witness to history there on the First Amendment side. Why don't you take us through that?
Well, first of all, let me just say thanks for having me here, and hats off to Dan once again. A well-deserved honor from a great bunch of people here. We'd been lobbing hand grenades and mortars at the Johnson administration, the Kennedy administration, from Vietnam and Washington, Sheehan and I, for a long time, and printing all kinds of stories that they didn't want. And I didn't know it at the time. Mort alluded to it. Even before the Pentagon Papers, I'd been wiretapped for some stuff that Kissinger and Nixon didn't like. But the hand grenades that we had been lobbing and the stories we'd been breaking were nothing. I mean, when I walked in that room and Neil pulled out those file drawers, and in this hotel in New York where we hold up the Hilton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan, we hid in plain sight. It was megatonnage. I mean, it was just, it was, you know, as you pointed out, it went all the way from Truman through Eisenhower, through Kennedy, through Johnson. And there was one thing after another that you could see. And these were things that we had suspected, we'd written about, but we had to write about them in a way in which, you know, sources were revealing to us. And then suddenly here you are, not just looking at a really well-constructed narrative. I mean, you have to understand the Pentagon Papers was set up, Mort and Les and others set it up as, I guess, 10, 12 chapters with each chunk of history. And we actually had file drawers. It was, you know, here were the 50s, and here were the late 50s, and here were the early 60s, here were the mid 60s, here was up to 68, and there was a diplomatic annex. I mean, it was just, it was enormous. And it was a well-constructed book with thousands of pages of top secret, eyes only, and other classified documents. And by the way, a whole lot of stories from the New York Times and other publications that had also been classified top secret. I think Mort once told a wonderful story that it was classified not just because the documents were secret, but because McNamara, who had commissioned the study, didn't want Walt Rostow at the NSC or Dean Rusk or Johnson and Johnson's people to know that this was being done. And Mort can comment on that, but I always thought that was a funny angle. It was explosive and it was enormous. And I can understand, because Dan would periodically, I didn't know Dan. Dan was not one of my sources. He was a source of Neil's. But Neil would periodically have to go out and talk to Dan or go on the phone and connect with Dan. I can understand Dan's impatient, but I don't think Dan has any notion, or at least back then had any notion of how complicated this was for us journalistically to deal with. Neil, when I walked in the room, Neil says, "Oh God, we can write stories for the next 3 months. Rick, we can write a 2,000 word story every day." I said, "You know, we'll get 3 stories out and we'll be shut down by the FBI." That doesn't make any sense. So we decided they had to be bigger stories, okay? And then we tried a couple of stories on the basis of what the documents revealed to us as reporters, stuff that we had not known for sure before. And we filed those draft stories, and Jimmy Greenfield, the foreign editor, and Abe Rosenthal, the executive editor, said, no, we can't do that. We can't do just your exclusives. And we finally, in the end, decided we would basically report the Pentagon Papers. We would summarize them. Our stories would encapsulate in 5,000 words what they had done in 15 or 20,000 words, something like that, with accompanying documents. Then we had to get a team of researchers to verify. We wanted to actually verify that the documents were legitimate and that the papers were legitimate. They may sound funny given the people you've got on this phone call and given the history, but as a paper, we had to make sure that we were not getting something that was partly good or mixed up with something bad. Then there was a huge legal argument inside the paper. Lord and Day, the traditional law firm that had represented the New York Times for years, told the publisher that it would be treason to publish the papers, that they were going to walk out. And not only were they not going to walk out, they were not even going to look at the papers themselves, because that would contaminate them. Because we all knew we were at risk, but lawyers, for crying out loud, we figured they were safe. Fortunately, Jim Goodale was the general counsel of the Times. He believed that this was a good First Amendment case, could be defended as a First Amendment case. He then went and found Floyd Abrams, First Amendment attorney in New York, who then developed and argued the case, and they persuaded the publisher to go ahead. But Harding Bancroft, the executive vice president of the New York Times at that time, the #2 guy to the publisher, said he was against it, thought we were aiding the enemy and this was treated. So there's a lot of stuff going on inside the New York Times while Neil and I are trying to work our way through this. And then we're seeing, oh my God, the Gulf of Tonkin. There were these, I think they called them 34A, Dan, you'd remember, or Mort, you'd remember the designation, but there were operations. We had been running secret operations with the South Vietnamese into North Vietnam. So this was not, the attack on our destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin was hardly unprovoked, let alone what happened actually on sea at the time. And, and then, yes, we had reported that Westmoreland after the Tet Offensive of 1968, which had been such a disaster for us, that Westmoreland had asked for 206,000 more troops, which the Johnson administration denied. There had not been such a request. Well, it turned out when we got in the Pentagon Papers, we found out that the White House did not consider it a request, in quotes, italicized, until the president had approved the request. It was something informal. It was an ask. It was, I don't know what it was supposed to be. They were playing games. And we found out exactly what we had known before, but not for sure, that in fact, yes, President Kennedy had known about, had approved the Vietnamese army coup that overthrew Nguyen Ninh Siem, the Catholic president of Vietnam that we've been back. And so there was one thing after another. And Rick, thank you, Rick Goldstein, for your kind comments. But there was this sense of almost being pounded, like being a punching bag, that even though we had known and covered many of these stories, it was just unbelievable to see in black and white in real time. Neil said it one to me, we got them, Rick, we got them with their own documents in their own words. There's no way they can keep lying to us. These bastards have been lying to us for decades. We've known it, but here's absolute proof. Then there was a question about national security. Was this going to endanger national security? We didn't take that question lightly. A lot of people after the papers came out said, well, the New York Times doesn't care about national security. Very important what Mort said just a few moments ago. We were in 1971. The papers ended. The material in the papers ended with the Johnson administration in 1968. We were always at the New York Times extremely sensitive to whether or not we were ever jeopardizing American troops, whether or not we were exposing American active war plans, that we were not disclosing operations that were underway. That even goes back to the Bay of Pigs. And we stayed away from that. But when we looked at this, we said, look, at a minimum, this is 3 years old. There are no troops, there are no operations, there's nothing going on that we're revealing. It's all over. It's all history. Yes, it's going to be embarrassing to people. They've lied and they're going to be caught in it. I mean, you got McNamara, I think it was on December 23rd, 1960, December 21st, 1963. He says publicly he's encouraged by the way the war is going. On the very same day, he writes a memo to Johnson saying, we're in trouble if we don't turn the situation around in the next few months. I think he said the next 3 months, Vietnam is going to wind up with a neutral government or maybe a communist government. Totally opposite. And we had it finally in a way that we could lay it out. But we did not use the diplomatic annex. We used none of the material in that. And the reason was, and that had been my area, I was the diplomatic correspondent. I said, I don't know whether or not any of these strands of diplomacy that involve the French or the Australians or the Burmese or whoever, the Swiss, whether or not any of those strands are still going. And if we publish something from the diplomatic annex, we may jeopardize something that's going on, this actual peace negotiations. Now, I realize Mortis just said Nixon was expanding the war, but we couldn't take that position. What we had to do is to say we were going to protect secrecy. And so we didn't use that material. So there were deliberate decisions made not to use material that we thought might jeopardize national security. And we passed that up, by the way, back through the editors, Harding Bancroft and to the publisher. So the publisher had some sense that in the newsroom, we were paying attention to that issue and protecting the paper and the paper's integrity. But then there had to be, 15 or 20 editors had to actually process those documents, because when we were going to publish, we had to be able to publish the 10 sequences day after day after day after day after day, long enough to be a book like Gone with the Wind. So all that work had to be done before we started the first day. And then there were people in the composing room who had to be taken in on the secret and to set the type so the paper would break. And then the final story is on the paper ran on Sunday morning. It broke the story on Sunday morning. And on Saturday, we were all worried that the publisher might change his mind and decide we couldn't print the papers. And so Jimmy Greenfield took the publisher, Ponce Ellsberg, out to play golf all day to make sure that he was nowhere near the paper and couldn't get thinking about it. I don't know what else you want to hear, but the story was phenomenal. I think the most important thing for us, is certainly in the media and maybe even for the country, is that what Dan leaked and his courage, which is central, and the courage of the publisher, and by the way, the courage of Abe Rosenthal. Abe Rosenthal, the executive editor of the New York Times, was still a hawk on the Vietnam War. Sheehan and I had become well disillusioned with the war, as had many other people at the time. But Rosenthal was a hawk. But he agreed with us that these papers did not jeopardize American security in any way, that in many ways, as Neil said, they had been paid for and bought with the treasure and the blood of Americans. They were owed to the American public. The public and the Congress had a right to this information. And so he believed in that. So that courage was important. But I think the ultimate lesson, and particularly the day we're celebrating today, the day of the Supreme Court decision, says that the American media, thanks to Dan's trigger, told the government that the national security state, this is back to your opening theme, John, the national security state could not shut down the American media. And thank God, 6 justices on the Supreme Court agreed with us. You could not have prior restraint. You cannot have censorship in democracy. You want to come after us afterwards and show national security was damaged, show something was stolen. show we aided the enemy, go ahead and try it, but you can't stop the publication beforehand. And I think that's been important ever since. I think it affected the coverage of the Black prisons in the Iraq War, the illegal, I think, national security wiretapping, under the Bush administration, George W. Bush administration, and lots of other coverage that's come out since then. I think it changed the nature of the relationship between the media and the government. Not always for the best, but predominantly for the best. And I think that's vitally important. It has been important. And it's great to see other people exercising that same courage and that same freedom today in the media.
Well, thanks, Rick. Now, Dan, you jump in at any point in here because this is your show. But one of the things that came out in your book and our conversations is the power of the leak, and what brought home to you the power of the leak was the 206,000 troop requests that Westmoreland made when the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff Wheeler went out to Vietnam and asked Westy what he wanted, and he said he wanted 206,000 more troops, and that's a very interesting story. But I had not really focused on it until I read your book and heard you talk about your book when we had a book party for you a couple of years ago. Is that the power of the 206,000 troop requests leak demonstrated the power of the leak to you. And then I think Judith and Rick have that in your film, where you then took a baby step and leaked a enemy troop strength story to Sheehan, and then you took the big step.
John, just before you go on, the 206,000 troop story broke on the Sunday before the New Hampshire primary. And if you recall, Johnson at that point was running for re-election. He actually won the New Hampshire primary, but Gene McCarthy got 40% of the vote. And it was widely seen as a political moral defeat. So if you're talking about the impact of that, and then within the month, Johnson had decided not to run for re-election, if you recall. So the political ramifications of that story were really big, in some ways bigger than the security ramifications. And to us, the heart of that story was that it showed there was a huge rift within the Johnson administration. Clark Clifford in the Pentagon had taken over from McNamara. Warren Key in the State Department, Nick Katzenbach. There were people all over the government who were saying this is the time to restrain, to begin to de-escalate our involvement in the war, at the same time that the military was saying we need 206,000 more troops. It shattered the thing. It was a very pivotal moment. So I think knowing the content of that story helps explain maybe what Dan's going to say.
The timing was perfect, you're saying, from
Right.
the standpoint of the primary. Yeah. So Dan, why don't you
Sure.
jump in? Go back.
I would say that the leak, which I believe had the byline, Edric, remind me if this is true, I think of both you and Neil, if I recall,
Yes.
the 206,000. It was a quote, in effect, from the Wheeler report, who had just been out to Wheeler, General Wheeler, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, had just been out talking to Westmoreland. And his report, top secret, purported to report Westmoreland's request. In fact, the way he put it was a request for 206,000 more troops because of the dangerous situation in South Vietnam, which was a peculiar contrast to what Westmoreland had been saying since the Tet Offensive, which was that it had been a great victory for the United States. We killed some 50,000 North Vietnamese or Vietnamese opponents, which was about right, actually, that we had them on the run. And this was a pivotal moment in favor of operations in Vietnam. And then we have this report coming back purporting to say, no, situation is very, very serious. I'll tell you something actually that I just learned long after the trial, Rick Smith. I was charged in one of the counts in the trial with having released the Wheeler report. And Actually, I hadn't to the press. I was not, as you know, one of your sources. And here I was charged with it later because they did know that I had it. Well, I had given it to Bobby Kennedy, not thinking at that point that I was giving it to someone outside the executive branch, although he was a senator. He was certainly to come, not yet, a presidential candidate. Everyone expected that. He was the brother of a president. He had been attorney general. He had been, a key person in Cuban Missile Crisis and all this thing. So I thought of him as essentially a member of the executive branch. I didn't think of him actually that I was giving it to someone outside, even a senator. And looking back, I don't think I would have given it to any other senator that I can think of, and I didn't give it to the press. Of course, when the story came out, I thought maybe it has come from Bobby. Maybe I have been the indirect source of this, and either direct or indirect. Neil wouldn't, of course, tell me the source, but he assured me that it was not Bobby. And I thought, well, how could he know? Whoever he got it from, Bobby might have slipped it to whoever, Thurmond or anybody, and gotten it through. But Neil assured me, said, no, there's no connection. So I accepted that. An interesting thing is, though, that I'm saying is that I didn't give Neil, this is now 68, in 71, now 3 years later, 3 years later, I'm giving Neil all this stuff, and he was, he took, copied a lot of stuff, but eventually I gave him a whole box of the Pentagon Papers. I didn't give him the Wheeler report, and I'll tell you now, maybe for the first time, because I assumed he had it. I took it for granted that with the quotes you had in the newspaper report, you were obviously quoting from the Wheeler report. So I didn't bother to give him the report, which I assumed you had. Now, my understanding relatively recently, I forget exactly where I heard it was, no, you didn't have the whole report. In fact, that report would have served this purpose of dooming the escalation even more than whatever it was you did have, because it was just pessimistic from beginning to end. And when people ask me, do I wish I'd done anything different? It's burst on me only relatively recently. Gee, I wish I'd realized you didn't have the Wheeler report, and I would have given it all to you and you could publish the whole thing. Now, as John knows, Henry, better than anyone, he's the one who discovered that the Wheeler report was totally deceptive, that he was lying about what Westmoreland wanted and what he'd told him. And there was a whole other story to that. But in any case, he would have served the purposes of moving toward negotiation if the entire report had been put out. If I can mention one other thing, though, about the effect on me, when I saw that, whether it had come from me or where, I assumed that on the whole, it had come from someone else. I would have been glad to think that it had come from me, but I saw the reaction to it in Congress, which was that there was enormous amount of debate on this. Why 206,000? We thought this was supposed to be a success, a victory, and now he needs 206,000 more. And I was struck by the reaction because I thought, well, Westmoreland always asked for that. That kind of thing. I knew that he'd asked for almost exactly that same number, although slightly different units, but it added up to 206,000 back in May. And here we're all together on this cuirass here in Vonnegut's term. Mort Halpern was then addressing that issue, working for John McNaughton. And I've never heard the story in detail, Mort, but I'm sure you worked on McNaughton's memos on this and on a memo by him to McNamara, McNamara's memo to the president, rejecting for the first time Westmoreland's request. This is back in May. And as usual, Westmoreland had requested more, he wanted more, I should say. He wanted more. They'd negotiated what the formal request would be. But in the end, Westmoreland always agreed, yes, he's giving me everything I asked for. And LBJ said yes, and McNamara said, we are sending Westmoreland what he has asked for, 40,000. I think it was 40 or 45,000. And of course, that was a lie. What he wanted was 206,000. But I realized from the reaction in March, Congress had never heard before these large requests. LBJ, going back to July of 1965, when I was working on the problem, as Mort was later, McNamara they had concealed the fact that the Joint Chiefs had requested and were sending 100,000. That is to say, Johnson was sending 100,000, but he announced 50,000. And every time he would lowball the number he was actually sending so that Congress wouldn't realize how big the war was we were getting into. And he was just, had been doing this every time. So for once, someone, not me, it turns out I'm not clever, had told Congress what Westmoreland was actually asking for. And that's why they were reacting so strongly to it. And I realized, wow, they could have been told this long ago, years ago. They've never been told before. So I thought, okay, this time I want Johnson to know that somebody with high access at that time to the internal decision papers is leaking, is ready to leak. And if this time he sends 100,000 or 200,000 and says 50,000, the public will know that he's lying because somebody up there is leaking, as had never happened before. So I thought, gee, I've been derelict all this time in thinking it is wrong to leak. It is a betrayal of your promise. It's a betrayal of everything. It's undercuts the president who's in charge of all this. Leaking is wrong. That was my impression. Now I looked at this and I said, wait, it's informed the Congress in a very critical way here. Leaking is not wrong. So I wanted Johnson to know, as I say, that somebody up there would leak his result, his decision, whatever it was, before he made it. So I made a series of leaks. The idea was to have one every day, a top secret leak. And Hedrick, you won't remember this, I'll bet, but you were even involved in a prospective one here. I'll tell you in a moment. But I did leak the Sam Adams estimate at CIA that doubled the order of battle, that doubled the number of enemy we were facing, which he'd been arguing for almost a year at that point to do. Really, so that could have had, no, I don't think it had your byline, Rick.
Oh, that was Neil.
Was you? To my memory
Neil.
is that
That was
to obscure where that was coming, Neil told me, they gave it a Saigon dateline. I may be referring to a different one that you were involved in, but in one of the stories I gave, they said it was from Saigon rather than Washington, just to hide the tracks. And then I gave Westmoreland's top secret report to the president on a year-end report, which came in late January, as I recall. It was applied to the end of the year. And to paraphrase it, he was saying, top secret, to the president, we've expelled the enemy to the borders where we are pursuing him. It said or implied very strongly, we have emptied South Vietnam of NLF troops and DRV troops. And days after that arrived, top secret in the White House, the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, and the NLF hit simultaneously every province capital in Vietnam from top to bottom, and nearly every district capital. So not to go into it, I do take some credit for the following on that one. Westmoreland was fired, was told by Wheeler that day he was being kicked upstairs. The day that came out in the New York Times, he was going to be chief of staff, and then Wheeler came out to explain it to him. And I was anxious to see Westmoreland out of there, though I didn't foresee that I'd have that effect so quickly, because I had heard that he was interested in using nuclear weapons to defend Khe Sanh. But finally, I'm going on here. Let this be my contribution in a way, John, because you'll be coming back to this 206,000 with your role on it, what you discovered. But on this, one of the things I wanted to give was a series of cables between Westmoreland and the Pentagon. These were not top secret, as I recall. They were only secret because he was negotiating what he would say to the joint session of Congress when he came back at the end of the year. That's the one where he did say, there is light at the end of the tunnel. We can foresee an end to this and so on. So for a couple of years, he had the strategy that Johnson had limited it to in terms of the number of troops he would send was an attrition strategy. And his alleged goal was to kill more Viet Cong each week than they could recruit, than they could reserve. It was the turnover point, I think he called it. And He now said, we have reached the point where we are attriting them. And it was an attrition strategy. We are killing them more than they can recruit, more than they can bring down the cable. And for once, the Pentagon, all together with everybody signing this thing at the bottom, the kind of thing you don't usually see on a cable, except the draft if it's going out, everybody was on board in this. No, you do not have the evidence that there is a crossover point. It is not, you don't have the evidence, and it does not appear to be true. So Westmoreland comes back then and says, if I may paraphrase, well, would you believe this? And so he would come back and they'd say, no, that's false. There was no exchange like this that I ever saw otherwise in the Pentagon Papers. It didn't come out as far as I remember in the Pentagon Papers. So I had a series of about 8 cables or iterations back and forth with this one and saying, can't I say this? Can't I say that? No, it's just not happening. So here we had evidence of an intent to mislead or intent to deceive on this thing. Great. So I went to the Times and I gave this to Neil. I showed him the cables. I gave him a copy. He says, let's go in and talk to Tom Wicker, my boss in the Bureau. And there was a young fellow in there that I don't remember I'd ever met before, Rick Smith. Rick, just in a word, do you remember this meeting at all?
Yeah.
Yes or no?
Yeah, I may. Yeah, keep going. I need to hear a little bit more.
Okay. So you're sitting there. I didn't know what you were doing there or what this was. It was between Neil and me and, okay, Tom Wicker, fine. Head of the Bureau, Rick Smith, okay. Here I am giving him secret stuff here. The Westmoreland thing was top secret, but this was, I believe, secret. And I'd given him all these documents. So we tell him the story, and Wicker looks at me and says, Dan, we can't run this without more evidence. Can you give us documents on this? And I thought, is this guy crazy? He's asking me to give secret documents in front of somebody that I don't even know. Here, I knew Neil back from Vietnam. And I don't remember whether I'd met Wicker before, but he was a famous name, of course. And he was Neil's boss. I'm supposed to give evidence in front of Hedrick Smith that I'm passing over documents here, which I had given to Neil already before the meeting. And so I said something to the effect, well, you're asking me to give documents or things? And yes, we need documents. And so I forget exactly how the meeting ended, but I do remember coming right out in the hall. And I said, Neil, what the hell is going on here? Are you crazy? Discussing this in front of somebody that I don't even know? And he said, well, sorry about that. So in the end, they didn't print those documents. And for a long time, I had the impression that they were saving me from further FBI investigation, because at the end of the revelation about Westmoreland's report, it came out in the Wall Street Journal, there are 100 FBI agents looking for the source of these leaks. And so they didn't print the Westmoreland. I was giving Times credit for saving me on that. But Neil told me much later, really after the Pentagon Papers, that actually the reason was they got scared on the idea of printing actual documents. This was in '68. The actual copies I had, not just the notes that I gave on Westmoreland. And okay, so they didn't print it. But anyway, Rick, I thought there's a little footnote to your own experience. One last thing was when Wicker wrote his memoirs, this shows what you can rely on memoirs, even by the best of people with the greatest intent to tell the truth. He describes this episode and said, I asked him for documents and he wouldn't give us any. And I thought, oh, Tom, you must have, for memories lost here, and actually I had given those, in fact, and they didn't print them. But anyway, the 206,000 had the effect of Johnson saying later, I would have given what he asked for, doing something except for those goddamn leaks. And I'm glad to have played a part in that. But I think the major thing, of course, that he's referring to is the 206,000 leak that started it off. So congratulations. I don't know if you got a Pulitzer Prize on that one, but you certainly deserved it.
It was nominated.
I'm sorry?
The story was
So-
nominated, but the story was really important to us, Dan, for the revelation that Clifford in the Pentagon, Harry McPherson in the White House, Nick Katzenbach at State, and lots of other people. I think Townsend, the Air Force Secretary, that there was this huge rift within the administration, and Johnson was coming under pressure to de-escalate, and that's what actually happened. Later on, he did de-escalate. In the next month, in that very month. So I think Johnson saying he would have given Westmoreland the troops, except for the leaks. I don't believe so. I think he was up against.
Well, can I ask Mort a question? Mort, if you're there, you were right on the inside on this. My vague memory, and I'm not sure on this, is that Clifford, when he came into office, which was just that month after McNamara left, was not actually opposing the request at the beginning. He put into effect a working group to look at alternatives. I was invited to do that. I think I was the only outsider in the sense that I was a RAND contractor who was in on that. And that's why I had access to these documents. Normally, I would not have had access to these ongoing flow of documents in the Pentagon, but I was because in that working group. Tell me, Mort, is it the case that Clifford was definitely opposed in the as he came into office to that 200,000?
No, Dan, you should read Clifford's memoirs, which I actually read.
I have.
Which I read today. But if you don't always remember, but having
Not
read
today.
them today, I still remember what they said. Maybe not tomorrow, but he says he came in a supporter of the war, as he had become as soon as he had been opposed to going in a big way, and had been overruled by Johnson going with Russ and McNamara. And then he came in still believing what he believed, which was having gone in, we needed to stay in and could win. And then during the month of March, his first month in the Pentagon, he says he was persuaded by the people he inherited in the Pentagon, and mentioned 5 or 6 of us, who persuaded him that that was wrong, and that McNamara had just given the president a memo saying we needed to get out, we needed to set a date, we needed to stop the bombing. And that's what led Johnson to decide to get rid of McNamara. So he came in having told Johnson that he didn't agree with McNamara's memo, but then during the month, as we had this debate, and it was not only open to you for the first time, but these things had been handled by McNamara with almost nobody else knowing about them. Maybe one other person in the OSD office, but this was a bigger group, and with Johnson had ordered a thorough review of Vietnam and put Clifford in charge of it. So for the first time, many of us saw documents that we never saw before and got to engage in this discussion.
Mort, can you expand a little more on how the kind of the paradox of, here you had a great example of civilian control of the military, but the way that got exercised was McNamara would negotiate with Westmoreland, and Westmoreland would always ask for the wider war, right? He always wanted
Well, there were 2 things going on that were kept from the American people and from most of the government. One was Westmoreland would ask for a very large number, like 206,000. Then McNamara and Wheeler and Westmoreland would negotiate. And eventually McNamara would tell Westmoreland what he was prepared to recommend to Johnson, that Johnson give him. And then Westmoreland would request that. And then the reason they said they denied the 206,000 request had been made is that they counted a request when there was an agreed number, which was then presented to the president for his official approval. So that was one thing that was going on. It was not true Westmoreland was getting as much as he wanted. But the other thing that was kept from the American people was that what Westmoreland really wanted was permission to widen the war, and to go into Cambodia and Laos, and to go into North Vietnam, just above the DMZ, and to do much more bombing in the north. And he wanted the larger number of troops, first of all, to have a reserve so that he could do those things, but also because he believed that if he got more troops, there would have to be a mobilization of the reserves. And if the reserves were called up, the American people would demand that we stop putting these constraints on how we fought the war, and that they would win the fight to expand the war to North Vietnam. And the chiefs wanted a call up of reserves, in part because they thought we were stretched too thin. And if there was a crisis in Europe, we didn't really have the capability to deal with it. That McNamara was shading what he said about how many troops we had taken out of Europe. And the chiefs were really worried that if there was a war someplace else in the world, we would not be able to deal with it. And so their highest priority was to get Westmoreland's number large enough so that we would have to call up the reserves. But they also wanted the reserves called up for the reason that Westmoreland did, that it was increase the pressure to take the constraints off the war. So the American public were given the view that the fight was just about the number. How many more troops this year would Westmoreland get? When in fact, it was about all those other things as well, and they were much more important to the players in the game than the 206 number.
Right. So if you hadn't had the deceit that the bureaucratic politics that Wheeler was playing by changing the battlefield assessment, and the 206 stripped of the strategic options, look like he needs all these extra troops in order to not go down the tubes. And so the bureaucratic politics played into the misperception that was with the leak, which had this huge impact, as Rick was saying. It is fascinating. No actions, only consequences. So I see we've got a number of people want to ask some questions of Pat. Malloy?
Yeah. John, thank you for putting on this really interesting discussion. I was sworn in as an FSO on June 24th, 1965 by George Ball. We now know at that very time he would caution LBJ from escalating and making it an American war, which he did in July of 65.
Right.
And then I went on, I read the book on JFK by Logoval, and then I found out he wrote a book about the the French in Vietnam. I never knew that and I went out and got it, called Embers of War. The French had 500,000 people in Vietnam. I never understood that. They were there 8 years and they had to leave. And then I found out that he wrote another book called Choosing War, about how we got in. And essentially he says Humphrey in early 65, now he's vice president. So he's in the administration, he's the vice president, and he writes a long memo to LBJ saying, this is not the way to go. We've got to get it. We can't make this an American war. It's not winnable, and it's a disaster if we do this. And that LBJ got so angry that he wouldn't let Humphrey into the NSC meetings anymore. So, and what Logoval says is that people want to blame, the Bundy boys and Rusk and McNamara, but he says LBJ was the guy that really made the decisions and that escalated this war and made it an American war. Yeah. And the way he treated Humphrey sent a signal to everybody that's where he was going, and they did not want to take him on it. So I just want to know from guys that were inside, is that a correct interpretation of events?
Well, let me comment on that. I was inside at that time, but I did not know that Humphrey had written this memo, nor did I know it when I was working on the Pentagon Papers later in '67, having been in Vietnam for a couple of years. Humphrey's memo is not in the Pentagon Papers because it was not available. Correct me, Mort, if I'm wrong on this, but I believe it's the case. Like other memos of Doves who said, don't do this, and I could name half a dozen here, those were held so closely, so sensitively, in the sense, sensitive because it would be against the president's choice to have reveal that there were people inside on the other side from the Joint Chiefs who were saying, stay out or get out. So Clifford's advice in July of 1965, which was, I see nothing ahead but catastrophe for my country. He said this across the table from McNamara at Camp David. And he says, 500,000, this is July now, 65.
Yeah.
We had about 100,000. And at that time, Johnson was about to send another 100,000. 500,000 troops, 50,000 dead. That is not for us, he said, but it was for us. That's where we went, 550,000, 58,000 dead eventually. But so Clifford is saying that was not in our, available to us in the Pentagon Papers. Again, I defer to Mora on this, who was the head of the Pentagon Papers project, but it's my belief that none of that came out. And now, Patrick, you say you worked for Ball, if I heard you correctly.
No, I was sworn in by Ball. I was just a young FSO.
Oh, but you didn't work directly for Ball? Okay. I talked to, and you may remember his name, an assistant to Ball, an aide to Ball, as I was a special assistant to John McNaughton in the Pentagon. And he wrote a memo almost exactly like Humphrey's at that time. I don't know if you've ever learned this, you might not, but again, not in the Pentagon Papers. There were some related memos by Ball that gave him the reputation of devil's advocate, but he actually believed exactly in what he was saying. That was just a cover. And he was saying, stay out. And he was writing almost exactly what Humphrey, he said it earlier in the fall of 64, what Humphrey was saying in February of 65. And Humphrey was even saying, as a politician who could count votes and was as concerned about the Democratic Party as LBJ or Clifford. And he was saying, you will, if you go ahead, you may not get the nomination of your party. You will be opposed by people in your own party. And if you did get it, you might well lose on this if you go ahead. And as you say, he was ostracized then. He wasn't even invited to NSC meetings for about 10 months, of which he is a statutory member as vice president. They wouldn't tell him when the meeting was. The point being, on the one hand, the extreme secrecy of the fact that there always were an authoritative, detailed, specific critique of the policy that either the Joint Chiefs were taking or that McNamara and the president were taking. There was an alternative, always that was being, if I had read those memos in 65, which I did not as special assistant, I can't imagine that I would have gone to Vietnam. They were so compelling and raised the question of how could Johnson have done this in the face of people like Clifford and Humphrey, Ball, the head of Hughes, the head of intelligence in the State Department, and a number of others, including my own boss, John McNaughton. As I say, one can only speculate about that. One result of this then for the Pentagon Papers, which no one has pointed to, let me point to 2 points that have been left out of this month of commemoration of the Pentagon Papers. One, what it shows very clearly is that if the Joint Chiefs strategy had been followed, the war would have been very much bigger at every single point. And Johnson was holding that down. In fact, my own guess is why McNamara stayed in 66 and 67 was to hold a ceiling on the bombing and the troops and not let them do what it turns out he, as an aide to LeMay, had done to Japan in the firebombing in 1945. So that's what they wanted to do, or the Air Force wanted to do. He was keeping them from it. I think very few people in the anti-war movement have ever really realized that the war was not fought to the level, to the brutality and murderousness, much as that was, as the Joint Chiefs wanted, and could have been if the president had done with the Joint Chiefs. Now, their strategy was not tested, fortunately, in my eyes. But when people say that the Pentagon Papers say the war showed that they knew the war was not winnable, that's false. Again, Mort knows this very well. The Joint Chiefs always said it was winnable from the beginning, from 61, 62, 64, 65. It was winnable right to the end if you did what they wanted, which Johnson felt, I think correctly, was a way of bringing the Chinese into the war, was bound to bring the Chinese into the war, in which they were prepared to use nuclear weapons against the Chinese in that case. So on the one hand, it was neither I nor anybody else that I know of risked prison in the Vietnam War because we thought the war was not winnable. That was not my problem, that the war was not winnable. 5,000 Americans, like Randy Kaler and Bob Eaton, went to prison for draft resistance to make the strongest case they did. Not one of those 5,000 went because he thought the war was not winnable. They thought the war was wrong. And when I had read the entire Pentagon Papers, I came to the conclusion from the early parts of it, not only continuing it was wrong, which most Americans thought by 71 or even 69, but it was wrong from the beginning. And so that's why I follow the example of others to go to prison on it. And as I say, the other point was the rift between the Joint Chiefs and but what the Pentagon Papers did not reveal was how prescient a number of doves were in the administration. I think Rick mentioned a couple of others. You could say Rick Katzenbach and some others, Nick Katzenbach and some others were, as John McNaughton's diary shows, which has become available to me only a couple of years ago, and which started after I had gone to Vietnam. As he shows, he was not alone in feeling that we should get out of Vietnam, as I knew he did. Nearly everybody he was working with seemed to feel that way, certainly by 67. He died in June 67. The war was being pursued by people who, except for Rusk and Johnson and probably Westmoreland, felt we should get out. But they did what they were told. They kept their mouths shut. They didn't tell about it. And a lot of people died because of what I call the silence of the doves. They kept their mouths shut when they realized that this war, I don't know how many of them knew enough of the history to know that it had been wrong from the start. Others like me, who didn't know the history, thought, well, it's wrong to continue at this point. And that was widely felt. But they did their job. And I'll tell you one person, Mort Halpern joined my defense team at the risk of his career later on, paid a price for that. He didn't mention in all the connections he had with this that he was a key person in the defense team. He is I don't know if you could say wannabe lawyer, but a very good lawyer without a degree. And he was critical to the defense team, which was a terrific bar to his getting in, unless I'm mistaken, to the Carter administration, and later came up to bite him in the Clinton administration even. In any case, he's the only one I know of who had enough priority on this war to take a risk of his career. And that sounds hyperbolic, but think about it. Anybody is free to refute that. I don't look at the Pentagon. I don't look at the stuff that wasn't in the Pentagon Papers because it was so sensitive it couldn't get in. The dovish critiques, not one of them took a risk of any kind with their career, even though they paid some risk internally, bureaucratically, for even saying the truth to the president. But he would then hold it. By the way, Ball's assistant told me, no, he hadn't seen Humphrey's memo. As far as he knows, they didn't exchange them. They were told not to show anybody else because who knows, there might have been a cabal getting together to try to save lives and get us out of there. But no, they didn't even know. But by 67, they did know. They had what they called, I think, a non-meeting meeting, something like that, where they'd get together, no record of it, whatever, and kvitz and complain and think about how can we get out of this war? How can we help Johnson, as like Townsend Hoop's reports, how can we help cut this down without risking our career? That last part is never explicit, it's just taken for granted. In other words, no thought of going to Congress with what they knew, no thought of releasing memos by the carload, which existed, which they had and which they were writing to any member of Congress, known to me. Certainly it wasn't getting out, let alone the press. And finally, one thing I've learned from this month is that I didn't know before was how worried the press people were at their possible prosecution and their willingness to go ahead in spite of that. If I had known at that time that they were worried about that, I would have thought, no, that's not in the American tradition here. That's so blatantly against the First Amendment. There's no risk. I'm the only one who's taking a risk. I was wrong. There was, in fact, a grand jury that was looking into Hedrick Smith and Neil Sheehan. James Goodale said, who was for the Times, said it was his understanding that Neil was virtually certain to be indicted, and possibly Rick also. So they were at risk. And what we read this month is they were worrying from start to finish, which I didn't know. I didn't know what was going on. And they were right to worry, and they went ahead. So the press did their job at that point, and it had its effect under our Constitution. And not one other member of the executive branch deserves credit in that period for what they actually did. Well, they did hold a ceiling on it. Their effects internally did have an effect. I don't want to say that. It would have been much bigger, but they did not go the step further of risking their career in any way or their future appointability by defying the president.
That's new info. I didn't realize that. So Mora, hats off to you. I didn't realize that you paid a price for supporting Dan and his defense. And Dan, we're not giving you the Defender of Liberty Award for leaking the Pentagon Papers because it stopped the war. Because I think, you more and less others thought that it wouldn't, and I think you said you told Dan at the time that the disclosure.
Not at the time. We didn't discuss it at the time, of course.
Well,
no.
I mean, when was it? Later, right? You later said it was later. So why don't you tell that story because it didn't stop the war, but what it did is it took down Nixon, because if Nixon ignored it, it would have gone by. But it was like a you were like a bull charging this red flag matador thing, and Nixon went berserk, set the plumbers up, and then basically you brought Nixon down.
Yeah, but
which shortened the war.
The key is that Dan was brought into the Nixon administration by Kissinger and by me, and that Nixon thought he had papers about the Nixon administration, including the responses to Nixon, but also probably the options memo on Vietnam that we did at the beginning of the administration and other documents. And you remember Nixon wanted to go and firebomb the Brookings Institution, and it was because he thought there were papers there about the Nixon administration. And so he then set up the plumbers, and then they had the plumbers do Watergate, and then they went after Dan's psychiatrist, and they went after Dan personally. And it's that stuff that helped bring the president down. If they had just focused on the Pentagon Papers, I think the content of the Pentagon Papers would not have ended the war by itself, and did not end the war by itself.
Can I make a comment on that, Henry, John?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
By the way, I agree with, not surprisingly, but we haven't conferred on this, with everything Mort had said in this session. But let me elaborate just a little on that last point. For Mort to have said much later, when we talked about it, that he could have leaked the Pentagon Papers himself had he thought it would make any difference, but he didn't. That was a very reasonable judgment at the time. I wasn't that different from it. Why would you think it wouldn't make any difference? Because it ended in 1968, before Nixon came to power. And we're now talking, I was thinking, from 69 on. So how was something about these past presidents going to show what Nixon was doing? Well, it didn't. The public did not pick up the fact that I was trying to promote, because I didn't have the documents that Nixon feared I had, and reasonably feared I had, but no one had given them to me. So, but he had reason to fear that I had sources in the NSC, aside from Mort, Roger Morris, Tony Lake. I didn't know particularly Bill Watts or Larry Lynn, all of whom resigned at the time of Cambodia, including Mort as a consultant. And that was in 1970. So Nixon had reason to fear that they'd taken documents and might have given them to me, showing that he was threatening nuclear war. As Roger put it, he saw target folders for targets 1.5 miles from the Chinese border. This was in 1969, sending the Chinese quite a signal here and perhaps bringing Chinese air power into the case and getting Chinese airfields hit. When they quit in 1970, Roger said to me later, had they brought out the codename Duck Hook documents of 69 showing nuclear threats, escalation into Laos and Cambodia, other matters, perhaps invasion of North Vietnam, I think that could very well have swelled the anti-war movement to a point where it would have ended then. But as Roger said to me, we should have thrown open the safes and screamed bloody murder, because that's exactly what it was, end quote. And yes, not only they could have done it, but I'm saying year by year, that war, I believe, could have been stopped. There were some years when the momentum was such that it would have been hard to turn it around. But 64, 65 was not such a year, nor was 67. And indeed, if memos that Mort had helped draft for McNaughton and for McNamara at that time had been released to Congress and the press then, I think history would have been very different. There might not have been a Tet Offensive, as the Vietnamese learned that there were high-level people who were ready to cooperate. But it was Mort alone who told me in 69, he's not choosing the option we had worked on of getting out, of extrication, which he, in fact, Kissinger had pushed aside when he revealed it to the NSC. He's making threats in hopes of winning the war or getting the North Vietnamese troops out of Vietnam quickly. That never succeeded. They never got them out of Vietnam. And thus we both agreed, knowing the Pentagon Papers, two of the three people who'd read them at that point, Gelb being the other, we knew where that would lead. They weren't going to meet that demand. We knew that by late 69, it was clear. So the war was going to go on and get larger. That was the reason I did it. I didn't do it that I felt I had to go on, not because there were lies. There were lies every day in the government on all sorts of things, and there'll be lies tomorrow under any president. That's not news to anybody in the government, that the government lies all the time. You don't go to prison to reveal that. It was what the lies were about. And the lies were in pursuit, now as before, of not only continuing a war that the public expected Nixon to end, but was going to increase because he was making threats that I thought he would carry out when they failed, and that could involve nuclear weapons eventually. We didn't know he was, I think neither Mort nor I knew, I didn't know it because Mort didn't know it, that he was actually threatening nuclear weapons right then in October of 1969. But we could see it going in that direction. So with that in mind, then, it seemed to me a high priority to try to hit that off. And it didn't work because, as Mort had earlier guessed, no, the Pentagon Papers impressed people that they didn't all know the government lied as much. They didn't believe it without documents. And I didn't have documents on Nixon. So they didn't believe it when I told them and reported Mort that that's what was happening. It had no effect there. However, Nixon's realistic, not paranoid, concern that somebody, not Mort, who had left the government, might have given me documents showing his nuclear threats and his escalation problems, had to shut me up. And he took measures that were in that day criminal. Since 9/11, they're not, except one might say for the one to incapacitate me totally on the steps of the Capitol on May 3rd, 72. Congress has not actually, even after 9/11, legislated that one to make legal. But when Obama let it be known very openly, no complaints from anybody, that he had ordered the execution of an American citizen, Anwar al-Awlaki, by drone, without any due process, any judge, jury, anything else, assassinated an American citizen. Later, for weeks, we still don't know why, his 16-year-old son, and I was told the other day, his daughter, later under Trump. I wasn't aware of that. In other words, that even has been legitimated. just as in effect, Obama legitimated torture by refusing to prosecute any of it. He says, let's look ahead, not behind, indicating that torture, which has clearly been proven, was not a indictable offense. I think in the future, I don't see how they can prosecute anybody for that after the last number of years. So what I think is essential is to demand that more people act like eventually Lord Halpern in working on that trial and in giving this information. He was giving it to a person with top secret clearance who believed him because I'd read the history. And he told me later, he told other people, and they simply hadn't believed him. Well, nobody believed me without the documents. So the war went on. It was bigger the next year in 72 than it had been in 71 with the offensive of 72. Christmas bombing, the heaviest bombing in human history for 10 or 11 days. That looked as though the Pentagon Papers had had no effect. And they hadn't on the war, except that in our constitutional system, what Nixon had done to prevent his secrets from coming out was then criminal and should be held as such. Remember, the Cambodian bombing was dropped as an impeachable offense because the Republicans wouldn't go along with that. Foreign affairs, in other words. So the president is, in effect, acts with impunity as far as we can see. Remember, there was nothing on that in impeachment now. This is a fund for the Committee for the Republic, as I understand it. We have an empire. It is a covert empire, which means plausibly deniable, which means you invent or you put together evidence to back up a cover story, a false cover story as to who is doing what abroad. We plausibly deny that we are an empire and what we do to maintain it, like every empire. Assassinations, invasions, military coups, bribery, other things. In terms of foreign policy, the idea that the American public has much influence over foreign policy is simply wrong. We're not the sovereign public, although the First Amendment is there to assure us that we have that capability. So the press has at times lived up to that. Pentagon Papers being a sterling time. But nobody learned enough from that on the outside of the government to keep exactly the same thing from happening in Iraq 30 years later or so, 40 years later. And an aggressive war, a crime against the peace for which no American paid any accountability, whatever, and which is still going on. Like Afghanistan, 21 years after it started, American boys must be still on their way out, maybe, of Afghanistan. Some of the ones coming out, I'll bet, were not born when we started bombing and killing Afghans at that time, 21 years ago. So a democracy in foreign affairs lies ahead of us for what we're to do. And what is shown by all this history is each of these people we've talked here did have an effect. It shows that it's not impossible, but it was very unlikely to have any effect, very unlikely, and yet it did. So to say, I can't take this risk, as everyone said in the government, or virtually, because it will have no effect, that's wrong. You can't say it's impossible. It did happen. And unless we see more moral courage in executive officers and Congress and the press, actually, except for the people who did take these risks here, in the future than we've seen in the past, then I don't think we'll escape from the consequences of global climate change or further interventions or the turn nuclear, as could happen over Taiwan right now. So this is a very timely discussion. Thank you, John.
Well, Dan, this is I don't want to say this is the end, because this is the beginning of what I hope are many more conversations we want to pursue with you. We've had some great discussions about the distinction between what you did and the other whistleblowers, Snowden and Assange. We'll continue to discuss that with you, and we want to dive into the nuclear thing, which we just couldn't do given the ground we wanted to cover on Vietnam. But I think I represent everybody here saying that, you know, you're a great American, great patriot, a citizen of a republic. You stood for separation of powers. You stood for freedom of the press, and I'm delighted
John,
to know you.
John, can I add one little brief comment here, John?
Yes.
It's Ron here. I know I'm not on video. Dan, you mentioned the Christmas bombing of '73. I remember that vividly because I was watching a new movie that was released called Slaughterhouse-5 by George Roy Hill. And you remember that's about the bombing of Dresden. So as I was watching the movie about the bombing of Dresden, I knew, because it was on the news, that more tonnage was being dropped in North Vietnam than was being dropped in those 3 horrific raids on Dresden. And I remember going completely numb in my seat. Unbelievable that me as an American citizen, I was part of that atrocity going on. Just thought I'd share that with you.
Thanks, Ron. So we have a lot of questions still, but Dan, you got your pacemaker, and I'm amazed that you continue to amaze us. So here's to you, and thank you, Hedrick, Mort, our film team. Terrific film. I encourage everybody to watch it, and we look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you.
May I make a short comment? Or,
Sure. Ted Postal.
I just want to raise this question because Hedrick Smith made a comment that I think my reaction to it may be inappropriate, but I'd like to share it, which is that the press somehow learned that it was important, that there was that it should stand up to the government. I think that my experiences most recently in the last couple of years with the press is that people are completely unwilling to face, to entertain even the most compelling and straightforward discussions about issues that occurred, for example, in the case of the Damascus 2013 nerve agent attack in Syria. I think what happened there is the equivalent of Vietnam, where people claimed there was an attack that didn't actually occur. I mean, it did occur in the case of, it was a nerve agent attack, but the intelligence report that was published by the White House absolutely had to be a cooked report. And in a draft paper, Chaz Freeman saw it, I showed it to him. And nobody wants to discuss the fact that we could have another Bay of Tonkin situation that could have resulted in a war with an escalation in war with Syria. And nobody wants to discuss the fact that there was a false intelligence report behind it all. And it may have even been a report that misled President Obama. I don't even, and if anyone's interested in this, I'm happy to provide, this draft paper.
So Ted, your point is that basically that the Pentagon Papers was the high point of whistleblowing, high point for the media, but the media is not today. New York Times is not today what it was when Hedrick and my wife.
It's a sad shadow. It's a sad shadow.
And Rick, you don't need to respond to that.
No, you don't have to. I'm not. But if anyone's interested, please let me know, and I will send them the document, and we can just have a discussion about it.
Okay, that's something that I'd like to see happen.
Yeah.
Thank you. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ted.
Thanks, Mort.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank Rick Smith.
Good.
They're all
Thanks,
terrific.
you, Rick.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Rick,
Mort.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, John.
Rick, and thank you, Rick. Thank you, Judith. Ron, thanks.
Thanks, everyone.